Mannie Manim interview, take one. Was that loud enough?
I grew up I was born in Cape Town, but through various circumstances, my dad died when I was very young, etc. I ended up in Johannesburg, living literally up the road from Ellis Park, the rugby ground, and then also a cricket ground. And we weren't wealthy, it was just my mom and I. In fact, we were poor. And I got a message very clearly from my mom that I would have to leave school at Standard 8 or I'd have to pay my own way to get to matric kind of thing, which was my first aim at that time. And I think also long pants were a second aim. And down the road there was Ellis Park. And on a Saturday morning, if you got there at 5 a.m., around there was a group of young guys who would, as the Coke trucks came in, the gates swung open, and if you were fast enough and big enough and whatever, you could jump onto the back of a Coke truck and you could get inside the ground. And once you were in, you were legal, you were fine, and you could join the queue of guys who were wanting to sell Cokes or sell programs or sell whatever was going on the day. And I joined a group of these guys, and we used to sell Cokes on Saturdays at the big rugby games at Ellis Park. And it's through that connection that I ended up kind of gravitating to the theatre, because one of those guys went on his school holidays in July of a year. And I think it was my 15th birthday or 14th birthday, and he said, okay, I've got this job, I'm an usher at the Brook Theatre, and anybody can have it, but you've got to give it back to me at the end of the July holidays. And I said, yeah, I'll take that, because it's another chance, maybe even buy a bicycle if I got this job. And that's exactly what happened. I went, was an usher for a month, fell totally in love with the theatre. I think I was a very good usher in the first couple of weeks anyway, because I was just, watching what was going on stage and so on. And at the end of that month, on the last night, I remember I'd organised, I was taking all the guys for a Coke and a burger on the corner cafe as my farewell do. And the manager, Aubrey Lowe, who became a great friend of mine, came to the front and said, you and you, we want you to be working backstage in the next, we want you to be working backstage in the next production, starting Monday. So I said, hey, but what about this guy? He said, no, he'll be fine. He'll have his job and you'll have this extra job. You'll be ushering until whatever time, showtime, and then you go backstage and you'll move the trucks. It was South Sea Bubble, it was Dulcie Gray and Joss Ackland, and we had to push a truck across the stage. So this earned me some money. I always make the joke that I joined theatre to earn money. And secondly, that it got me involved backstage. But what was going on then too was that crowd of guys that used to leap onto the back of those Coke trucks was a licorice all sorts. That crowd of guys was made up of people who lived around Ellis Park and who needed the money. And they were all races and creeds. And so at that age, if you like, although I was going to an all-white school and I was living in a relatively white area, although it was a kind of a twilight zone, I'd started to understand that not everybody was allowed to do everything, and there were events that were happening. I mean, Barney tells the story once that he took his black friend to the cinema, and Barney lived up the road from me, I learned later. And he went to our local, which was near Jeppe Station. And he took this guy and he was going to go and see the movie on Saturday morning or afternoon. And the guy said, sorry, your friend can't come in with you. And Barney said, well, why not? And he said, well, because he's black and you're white and we can't have black people in the cinema. And I was kind of in the same place in a different way, that not understanding that these people were any different to me, but then beginning to understand that in the greater context, these people were being treated differently to everybody else. So, jump, I don't know how many years, but it's about 10 years later, I'm running the Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal's drama department. I'm the administrative head. The artistic head is a guy called Francois Swart. And we've got 65 full-time actors earning good salaries, getting holidays, medical aids, pensions, all that kind of thing. I always used to joke, just like secretaries do, who work for the arts councils. Anyway, at around about that time, it dawned on me for various reasons, because we were trying to take our work everywhere. We were taking our work into the townships. We were inviting people of all colours to come and see dress rehearsals. We were kind of bending the rules every which way. We even in a theatre called the Arena that we'd built in Doornfontein out of an old mining magnate's house, we'd had John Carney and Winston Chawner playing a midnight show of Sizwe Banzi is Dead to people that we knew, that we picked up the telephone and phoned them and told them to phone their best friends and that kind of way. And we'd sold out the little arena, 100 seats, for a week. And this was money to help them on their way as they were heading for either back to America or Australia. I can't remember which. And round about that time, I think the realization was dawning heavily on me that these 65 actors were all white, and that what I was running was something that was only for white people. During a December holiday one year, we used to hire out one of our venues, the Brook Theatre in Pretoria, and all the white staff and crew were on their annual leave. I only had a black guy called Winnie Isaiah Satimu was going to be the only possible stage manager. The show starred Dave Marks, who later had a real relationship with us at the market, and I had to have a stage manager. So I went to Dave, who was the best person in the world I could go to, who would run the free people's concerts at Wits University. And I said, Dave, we've got a stage manager. He's a very experienced guy, but he hasn't been called a stage manager in the past. He's been a senior mech, if you want to call it that, in sort of British terms, a mechanist. But he knows how to run anything. And Dave was totally in favour. And Winnie ran that show over the holidays. Nobody sort of above my level knew what was going on. But we weren't allowed to have anybody above the rank of stage mechanist, stage hand, that was of colour. Any person that was darker than I was not allowed to have any managerial title next to his name. I think this part of the law was called job reservation. There was definitely a conscious effort by the government to reserve certain jobs for whites only. Even if there was a black man that was eminently, or a black woman, eminently more qualified than a white counterpart at the time, they weren't allowed by the law of the country to go any higher. And it's kind of, I don't know what other words to use, but at the time, it affected your everyday life. But as you were a kind of mere mortal, if you like, there was no way you could resolve it. So we used to do it in small ways. We used to do it in little increments, if you like. So Francois Swart, who was also of a similar mindset at that time, used to use black guys as stagehands. They were good stagehands. And then he'd have them in crowd scenes on the stage. And then things would go a little further, and he'd have them saying a couple of lines on stage. And then we would be challenged by board members of our Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal, maybe even in the foyer on the same opening night or something, saying, "Hey, Mannie, didn't I see a black guy acting in that auction scene?" Say, "Oh, no. They were just coming on stage to get ready for the scene change that was about to happen." So in this way, we kind of slid through various loopholes. Well, it comes down to one night during my time at the Brook Theatre, during those first couple of years when I was now working backstage and in the front. And on one, okay, so again, I was always on the lookout for extra work. So up came Sundays. Brian Brook was a commercial theatre management, and he used to find ways to let his theatre out at every day of the week. So on Sunday nights, he would let the theatre out to classical music concerts, where I got a bit of a liking for classical music. Lots of chamber music concerts were held. And there was we didn't have TV in those days, so there was an Afrikaans, no, it was in English, it was bilingual, variety show that took place on Sunday nights called Shell Music Hall. And it starred Nico Carstens, who was a great piano accordionist, and Dan Hill's band. Dan Hill had a band on the day. But then during that time, one Sunday night, I was told, you're going to be there this Sunday night and there's going to be a play. And lo and behold, it was my job to pull up the curtain and just see that everything was kind of reasonably spick and span. And what happened on stage was that Athol Fugard's No Good Friday, starring Athol Fugard and a whole group of actors from Dorkay House up in Motortown, were performing the very first production of this play called No Good Friday, which had an all-black cast, one white dude played a white priest, Athol himself, and they were telling the story. You know, I was in this theatre that was doing white commercial theatre to white audiences. And on that night, Benny Bonacorsi was raising funds for Athol and his work, and they presented No Good Friday. And it totally transported me, because there they were on stage with the accents from the streets around where I lived, and I'd been having this la-di-da stuff with, you know, tea and cucumber sandwiches and people talking in very British upper class accents, and completely unreal in a way, but very entertaining. Sold lots of tickets and kept us all in work. But on that night, suddenly there was this kind of adventure story, almost you could say, about this guy who was a shark who was running a protection racket in the townships, and the man who stands up to him and says, "No more." And Athol had fashioned a play out of these township real circumstances of the time. I remember the smoke break. There was a smoker's corner, was just off the stage, above a stairway coming up to the stage, and I met and talked to all these black actors, and it was a total eye-opener for me that there were these people who were a different colour, but who were performing on that same stage, where tomorrow night Brian Brook and his wife and various others, who I love dearly, would be doing their commercial English, British, American theatre. Well, this was way back. I can't remember exactly the year, but it must have been in the late 50s, around about 58. Talking to Athol, I've tried to. And it was so unlikely that maybe nobody was ready for it, and was on and gone before anybody ever knew. I mean, I haven't met another person who was present that night except Athol. And some of those actors I met after. Ken Gumper was one of the people on the stage. But the event itself must have been Benny Bonacorsi must have spoken to Brian Brook and said, "I've got this play," and didn't take it further. Or maybe Athol was the strange chap who worked with these black people, and they didn't really fathom what was going on. Yeah, well, certainly that night changed my life. I began to understand that theatre was more than just having a good time in comfortable surroundings and watching people who were like stars of the time or whatever. And in fact, I moved from that company to another company that was run by Leonard Schach, who used to have his headquarters down in Cape Town. And he was doing kind of more thinking man's theatre, if you like. He was doing Pinter, he did The 10th Man, he did various, he did Tennessee Williams, he did all the plays that were available to South Africa at the time, that were kind of had a bit more weight to them. And there was a moment when a number of the kind of creative team at the Brook Theatre moved to the Leonard Schach Company. Not because we didn't like anything Brian Brook was doing. He was a successful commercial producer, which is exactly what he'd always wanted to be, and gave a lot of people work. But Leonard was becoming a successful non-commercial theatre producer and director. What it was about it was that you came out with more than you'd gone in with. What it was about, and it was something that had echoes for me later on when we started the Market Theatre, was that it much more, that theatre reflected the lives of the people that were watching it. And when it was really in the groove, you were seeing on stage a reflection of the audience. In fact, when it became South African thinking person's theatre, when it became the kind of thing that we started to do and the space had started to do in their time. That night, having pulled up the curtain, usually I would just go and sit in the corner, maybe even read a book while the classical music was playing or something. But suddenly there were these guys on stage, you know, talking in these accents I'd heard every day around where I lived, and in a real life situation that could have been going on outside the venue as we were performing it inside the venue. So it was totally, for me, it completely captured me. It completely captured my imagination. It enthralled me. And in a way, and I always say this, it changed my life, because I suddenly understood that theatre was much more than pure entertainment. That theatre could be much more than just people buying a ticket, having a good time and going home, not thinking about it again. My beginning of that whole thing happened when we as PACT had presented, I'd seen down in Grahamstown, the first public performance was actually a dress rehearsal of Busman and Leonard with Athol and Yvonne. And we crept into in the dark theatre, Rhodes Theatre, late at night. They were starting a dress rehearsal, and Francois Swart and myself had watched Athol Fugard, Yvonne Bryceland doing Busman and Leonard. And at the end of the play, I'd gone up onto the stage and said to Athol, you know, we'd love this to come to the north, bring it up to Johannesburg, because they were then being presented by the company that Yvonne worked for, which was KPAP, the southern equivalent of what I was involved in the north. And he was terribly busy, I remember, and quite gruff, and said, okay, I'll see you tomorrow morning. And that was it. We were dismissed. The next morning, crack of dawn, bang, 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 on the door, Athol, perched on the end of my bed, saying, okay, you want to do my play? Now. You know, and then we started a conversation. So we ended up bringing a repertoire season of People Are Living There and Busman and Leonard to the Alexander Theatre and the Breitenbach Theatre. And in addition to that, thanks to Athol requesting it, and also us being very much wanting to do this, but not totally knowing how to, Athol introduced us to a man from Soweto, Mishak Musia, who became our tour manager for that tour. And while that was happening, and I think it went from us, one of its seasons here, it went abroad to possibly the Royal Court. At around about this time, we showed them what we were doing with the Arena Theatre in Doornfontein, where we'd sort of gutted an old mining magnate's house, made a 100-seater venue with dressing rooms and even a little art gallery and a little foyer. And we presented another, I think they were on their way to or from London, Athol and Yvonne again in Busman and Leonard, in this very tiny venue where you could virtually touch the actors. You know, and I don't think it was in the round, but it was kind of semi in the round, because that theatre was quite adaptable. And again, I remember Yvonne being very emotionally moved by that space and the accessibility of the audience to that space and so on. And I wasn't privy to any conversations between her and Athol or something, but I'd like to think that somewhere there were some seeds being sown, and that they were also, with Brian, I'm sure, talking about, we need to find a place, we need to find a place to do this kind of thing. But unlike us, who were just doing it for our regular audience, other than when we were doing these other things like Sizwe Banzi late night, which is it's quite interesting to talk about it now, because then my boss didn't know that it was happening, and we were doing it in their theatre, their venue. If we'd have got caught, who knows, but we didn't. My whole life, doing that kind of theatre, and then eventually moving on from that to the market, was you couldn't for a second start to get concerned, get worried. You had to just move forward and count your gains, not count your potential losses. And our gains certainly were accessibility of more people. The arenas were also where we started having what we called open dress rehearsals. And we would start off by contacting a number of the groups that we knew, a number of the black theatre groups that were very busy in and around Johannesburg. And Barney also knew several of the people who were busy making theatre and writing and so on. So we could very easily fill the 100-seater arena. And we ended up doing one dress rehearsal, then we used to do two, then we used to do three. And I can remember conversations with my then boss in Pretoria saying, why are you having 3 dress rehearsals of this production? It's very simple, it's one set. And I say, no, it's actually technically very difficult. We have to get the balance sorted out. So I would always be making up stories. And we actually went on to do the similar thing at the Alexander Theatre. And we took it a step further. We used to take our productions into the townships around Pretoria and Johannesburg. It was an adventure, and we knew that we were doing the right thing. We knew that we were opening up ideas, that we were opening up discussion, because after all those dress rehearsals, there would be open discussion afterwards. It was just a part of the territory, Of course, we had to talk about it, and we had to hear a lot of home truths from all those black theatre groups that came in to watch us, and would be very critical of, why did you choose this play? What the hell are you doing this thing for? And do you think you're talking to anybody? After tonight, none of our colour people can come into this venue. So what do you think you're doing? Yes, we did, because that was a very important part of what was the exchange that was happening. We did a lot of Q&As. In fact, all our pieces, particularly in the arena where it was a smaller group and easier to manage, we would want to have exchange with the audience to hear what they were thinking and to inform us as to what the thinking was of all the people that, because of our situation, we wouldn't come into contact with after dark. In Johannesburg, it was white by night. That was a real thing, and people had to slip around in the dark to come to these performances. And we also started doing theatre in the townships, and during that time is when, in fact, the seed of the market was planted. But that's another story. I was invited down for the opening. I was running this drama department of PACT in Pretoria, and I'd met Athol and Yvonne and Brian, obviously, during Busman and Nene, and people are living their seasons up here. And then the great moment, they were going to be opening. And I went down a couple of days before the opening. I went maybe a week maximum before the opening. And all I can remember is that I felt totally at home from the moment that I walked into the space. There was a feeling of welcome and a feeling of inclusivity and everything that I related to. There wasn't a kind of, but can't go further than this line or whatever. It was just wherever you wanted to go, there was can we show you, this is what we've got in mind here, and this is what we... Look, yes, there was wet paint, there was, there wasn't enough furniture, whatever, but it felt totally, in my mind, how you would start any good venue, any venue. And it was in the middle of town. It was, you just walk along the street and into what could be a shop front, and there you were in this performing place. And they had another venue, I think 1 floor up or maybe 2 floors up. And as things worked out, I think I sat in on rehearsal or something, and then Athol said, well, do you want to light this play? In his wonderful direct thing. And joy of joys for me, I got to be able to light the first production in that theatre, which was a total joy for me. And it just, I can't tell you what pleasure it gave me to be able to be, because that's what lighting does for me, is it stops me being just a spectator and it makes me a participant. And that's when I turned on to lighting, was that as a producer, I was always a spectator in a room. They'll go, oh, Manny's coming, very good today. And to walking into a room and being a lighting designer and we'll say, Manny, we've got a new scene, we want to show you. That was totally much more involving for me and much more enjoyable for me. Well, that was part of the challenge. It always has been. I mean, having too many or too few lights can be a challenge. To find just the right number is always a challenge. But it just was, I can't describe how joyous that whole experience was for me, and to be working on that play at that time. I mean, that play's title put it out there, when you're making a theatre piece, you're so involved in an interior group who are trying to make this thing work, who are trying to bring the story that the director, in this case the director-writer, Athol, wants to give to the audience, that you don't really think about what responses are going to be from the outside. You just know that this is the best place to be in the whole world at this second, because you're doing something that's vital. It's telling the truth. And, whatever we were doing was showing the truth to power in a way. It was right there and giving a chance for people to see reflected many of their thoughts. I mean, that play touched on a real nerve about that you couldn't fall in love across the colour line, that love would stop because a person's colour was slightly darker than yours. It was an absolute impossibility, and that play went to the heart of that. So I think it's very important that when I came back to Pretoria, I remember people saying, well, what did you think? And I said, I've been in fairyland. I've been in a place where people are realizing their dreams, and I've been in a place where it seems that everything is possible, but it's smell of an oil rag, there's very little to go around, but it's the most exciting place in the country to be at. It's a good question. No, I wasn't. They happened. I remember being with Athol in Port Elizabeth, and this is when the timing was that I was considering leaving PACT and starting a company with Barney and a couple of actors that we'd got together and said, we're thinking about this. We didn't know anything about where we would have a home. We didn't know how we were going to, but we wanted to get away from this great big behemoth that we were involved in, because Barney by that time was also directing for PACT. But we were wanting to do something that we thought was more important and that had more real stuff to it. And I hadn't seen either of them. But again, through happenstance, within the structure of the market, many people gravitated towards us, and a number of people helped us with a number of different things. One of our staff at that time was a relative of a Nationalist Party cabinet minister. And when we had passport problems, because we had some passport problems with our own actors at the time of the market and so on, that person also assisted with looking after the passport applications, particularly for John. I think somehow John Connie was a problem in those days in terms of not having the right papers and so on, and getting his passport. Well, I'd love to say that I was, but I don't think no. They went to the Royal Court, and then from there they were recognised and taken over to America. And we were lucky to be a stop on the way. That's how we had those midnight shows at the arena. And then we were also very fortunate to be on the way there and back. And it's how Civic Theatre and the Island played seasons in the main market theatre. Oh yes. Something very important, something vital was happening. I was talking about when I first heard about Sizwe and the Island. What in fact happened was, on my way, thinking about my resignation from the senior post and starting this thing with no money and just a lot of hope, I stopped in Port Elizabeth, and Athol and I, for some reason, were in one of his cars, small beat-up old car, I remember, was stopping at the Roadhouse, and Athol was remonstrating with me, saying, "John and Winston want to become professional." And I tried to tell him it's absolutely crazy. They've got jobs, they get family, they've got children. Now they want to become professional actors, and they want to do a play, and we want us to get together and make a play. And that was like the beginning, the step before. They did get into a room and make that play and take it to the space, and then the rest is history. The first time I saw Sizwe was in the Box Theatre at Wits University. It was again on its way to or from somewhere, and it's a similar moment to seeing No Good Friday backstage at the Brook Theatre. I was in the front row of a very small room, and these two giant energy actors were on stage where I could touch them. I'll never forget Winston. There's a big moment in the play, and I'm quite close to it now again, because we've just done a reproduction with John Connie's son Atandwa and Adisi Shabangu playing those two parts, directed by John. And Winston I could literally touch him, and he was doing "Am I Not a Man?" And it's a moment that stayed with me forever, and will stay with me until the afterlife, when I hope we meet and talk. I was, again, I've had blessings in my time. One of them was that when John and Winston decided, I think it was in the 80s, sometime later, maybe it was a little later, when they wanted to take the play on a triumphant tour of places they'd played. So we went to the Old Vic in London, we went to BAM in New York, we went somewhere in Toronto, we went to, and kind of being close to those two guys when they're making their statement, making their work happen, was like being with, that thing about an irresistible force, and well, that's what it was. It was totally that, and it's given me some of my best moments ever in this thing that I love doing, which is theatre, and theatre that speaks directly to the audience. Oh, there's no doubt about it that it opened people's eyes here that saw it, and when we took it abroad, it would open eyes all over the world there to say, my heavens, are you doing this back home? Are you performing this? And what are the conditions? And what are the audience? They were so fascinated to hear the story of how these things would happen in this place where it was born and where it was made. You know, that's something obviously we talk about a lot, and we're asked a lot. Did theatre change? We like to say that if it changed one person at every performance that we've ever done of many of these plays that we did, then it was worth it. And I'd like to think, I can tell you stories about people that I know were changed by the experience of certainly Sizwe Bansi and the island. And even today, we're still performing. We performed it last week in an supposedly Afrikaans festival in the middle of the Karoo in Oudtshoorn in South Africa. And Sizwe Bansi's dead is alive and well, and played to standing ovations. It's got 4 different nominations 10 days ago. Absolutely. We didn't have television, so we got it in the news, and no, totally, totally like, you see? Totally like, look, a lot of what's happened to our theatre over the time, I'd like to think of the space certainly in the market. And by the way, the space I've always known as blood brothers to the market. We're actually sitting in a theatre that I like very much, and I used to run, the Baxter Theatre, and I've always known this as like the wealthy cousins of the market. Not because they're particularly wealthy, but they're much more wealthy than we ever were in our wildest dreams. But the space was a blood brother. But the moment I heard that those actors, John Carney and Winston Chawner, had been given the Tony Award, singly for both of them, a Tony Award each, it just blew my mind, and it was, yes, that is it. We've done it. We've shown the world, because there still is to this day a great deal of put down about that's political theatre, that's protest theatre, a lot of boxing, a lot of confining it's damn good theatre reflecting the lives of the audience that we hope comes to see it. That's what it is. But a lot of people over the years, and even recently, are still saying, well, that's protest theatre, So they're trying to box it down. Okay, I wasn't present, but I was totally aware. I was aware that they were touring in the Transkei, and again, they were doing what is their wont to do at the time. They were taking the play right into the heart of one of the areas that they were totally critical of in the play. Transkei independence is shit, is a line in the play. There are lots of other lines that relate to it. And they, in order to do what they do, which is taking the truth out to the people, they wanted to do it in all those places as well. They even knew, talking to John since then, they knew that the police were there. And in many cases, the police had come to see their plays and afterwards congratulated them, saying, I liked your play, thought your play was great, man. And that would be the end of that, because that is again our wonderful South African reality of those days. But then, being in this Bantustan, as it was, of the Transkei at the time, those guys meant business, and they took them into what amounted to solitary confinement. I don't know all the details. John has been sparse with all those as time has passed, but it was a serious situation, and they were imprisoned. And if it wasn't for an international outcry, people from particularly the English-speaking countries, New York and London, the actors' unions in both sides were marching and standing outside South Africa House in London and so on, that really brought things to a head. And finally they were released. But it was a serious time. For a beat there, they were beyond where any of us could get to them. You know, it was the reality coming back to bite us in a way. You know, to say, you can do all this stuff, but sooner or later, John and Winston, once, you know, what was wonderful about them and has remained wonderful about both of them is their commitment to doing theatre that communicates with all people. And I think in days gone by, and certainly now again, they've become heroes for good reason, for all their good works that they've done over the time. Barney, I was introduced to by Athol. During that same season where I met Yvonne and Athol of Busman and Lena and people are living there at the Alexander and the Breitenbach Theatre in Pretoria, Barney was present almost from the day they got off the aeroplane until the day they left. So he was a camp follower. He was always present, and it became a natural thing of, well, who is this guy? And then, you know, it was things about, it's about time you two met. And Barney, in spirit, was right where the space was at. There was no distance between Barney and the space at all. And one of our first major successes was Warza Albert, which Barney directed, and he wrote with Percy Mtwan, Bongeni and Gemma. And we took it to the space, and that was the beginning of wonderful things for Warza. And it's kind of, maybe it's a little known thing, but it was at a performance on the opening night of Warza in Cape Town. I got a phone call on my desk the next morning with an American voice on the phone, a guy named Ken Brecker, who was the assistant artistic director of the Mark Taper Forum. And he said, "Hello, Manny, I'm phoning you to tell you that you're coming to America with Warza Albert. I saw it last night," and blah, blah, blah. You know, so in a way, again, the space was a very, very good news for us. In fact, it gave us that chance to expose our work further again. Yvonne acted at the Market in Mother Courage. Barney directed at the Space. He might have directed more than one production. I was so busy always running the Market when Barney wasn't there. I'm not entirely sure of everything that he did there. He also worked with Yvonne in London at the Riverside, I think, at Riverside Studios. That was the beginning of me falling in love with Barney's methods, was watching him work with actors, because I was used to some very strict disciplinarian type directors at that time. And then I met Barney, and there was this guy, you know, actors would, if you weren't plotting, meaning putting the moves down, by the second day of rehearsal, there was something wrong. And if you hadn't done that by the end of the first week, this was disaster. Barney very often would get to the third week before he started plotting the actors, you know. But also the way Barney did the plotting of the actors was that they said, "Barney, I think I should move here." He'd say, "Oh, do you? Okay, well, where do you want to go?" So this from directors who'd say, "On the line 3, you've got to move to the chair, turn left, pour yourself a drink, and sit down, whatever." Just know that we were both totally happy that it was there, totally wanting it to succeed, totally. We also had a Brian Asbury play up in the Market as well. He directed Woody Allen. I think it was Don't Drink the Water. He'll know. And that came up, and then it gave Barney an idea, and Barney did another Woody Allen, which I played again, Sam, which was a great success for us. So it was so easy to work with the space in those days. It was, and you know, it's tragic that it couldn't go on and didn't go on, but it very much made us feel that there were other people as crazy or as determined or as busy and as committed as we were. Well, very sad. I mean, Moira Fine was very involved trying to keep it together, and it just felt like sand running through your fingers. You know, it just felt like there wasn't enough to hold the centre. You know, and obviously by that time I was totally involved. You know, every day was another sort of adventure for us up there with this massive major project that we were trying to do. So it just felt too far and too hard and yes, too difficult to try and do anything to help put it together. We did whatever we could, but it obviously wasn't enough. What happened for me, my blessings continue. We had an extraordinary board, which was, I think, a major difference between us and the Space. We had an extraordinary board that looked after us in the market. We split our operating mechanisms so that the Market Theatre Foundation was a non-profit thing, and the company was CC, which I was sole director of, which presented the productions. So it was away from the protection of the market, if you like, but it was also away from any controlling influences from the market, because that could also have been a direct influence on what we were trying to do. So for us, running a theatre at that time was the only way to live. It was the only way to be alive in this place. It was the only way to ply the craft, the trade that I'd learnt and I was working in, and to have a sister theatre, as I called it, a blood brother theatre in Cape Town, the Space, was the most energizing thing for us at the time, and it was a singular great loss to us, to everybody involved in the market, when the Space was no more.